The landlord kept raising the rent and lying that renovations are expensive. When I moved out, I reported his left-wing business to the tax office. A year later, his house was put up for auction. I even thought about buying his apartment just so he could see me. My landlord kept raising the rent and lying about so-called expensive repairs. But in the end, he lost everything. And the best part? I was the one who pulled the trigger. That's how it started. My landlord, Richard, was the kind of man who smiled with his mouth but sneered with his eyes. Every month, without fail, there was some new excuse for why rent had to go up. The heating system costs more to maintain now, or the city taxes went up, I need to cover the difference, or his personal favorite. You know, I just had to renovate the building, it wasn't cheap. Except, there were no renovations. None. The stairwell was cracked and filthy, the paint was peeling, and the pipes made noises like a dying animal every time someone turned on the water. And the so-called heating system. Half the time, I was shivering in my apartment wearing 2 hoodies and boiling water on the stove just to stay warm. Still, I paid. Because what else could I do? I was in the middle of my studies, strapped for cash, and moving out wasn't really an option. But every single time I handed him that envelope full of money, I felt the sting of humiliation. I was paying more and more for less and less. And the worst part was the smug way he looked at me when I gave him the rent. As if I should thank him for letting me live in that dump. It wasn't just me. The neighbors whispered about him too. Old Mrs. Dawson on the second floor had lived there for 30 years, and Richard tried to double her rent in 1 year, saying inflation like it was some magic word. She cried on the steps when she realized she couldn't afford it. A young couple on the 3rd floor left in the middle of the night, unable to keep up with his adjustments. And me. I held on longer than most. But the moment came when Richard tried to push me past the breaking point. He showed up at my door one evening, dressed in his usual cheap leather jacket, waving a paper in my face. Starting next month, rent goes up another $200. I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind that escapes when you can't believe the audacity of someone. $200. For what? I asked. For the renovations. I had the roof redone, very expensive, he said smoothly. I looked up at the ceiling, where a water stain the size of Texas spread like cancer. Funny, I said, because my kitchen still leaks when it rains. He shrugged. Not my problem. Pay up, or you can find somewhere else. And that was it. That was the moment the idea was born. Up until then, I had just swallowed my anger, told myself to get through it, that things would change eventually. But standing there, watching his greedy little smirk as he demanded more money for nothing, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to just move out. I wasn't going to let him keep bleeding people dry. No, I was going to destroy him. Of course, I didn't let him see that. I just nodded, muttered something about figuring it out, and closed the door. But inside, my brain was on fire. I lay awake that night thinking of all the ways I could make him regret what he'd done, not just to me, but to every tenant who had ever suffered under him. At first, I thought about the simple stuff. Maybe I could trash the apartment before leaving, leave him with repairs that would cost him more than a year's rent. Maybe I could post his number online somewhere shady and let strangers blow up his phone. But those were small, petty ideas. And the more I thought about them, the more I realized they weren't enough. Richard deserved something big. Something permanent. Then I remembered a conversation I'd overheard once, when he thought no one was listening. He had been bragging to another landlord about how he kept things off the books. He laughed about how stupid tenants were to pay cash. No paper trail, no taxes. Just pure profit. That was it. The weak spot in his armor. His greed had made him sloppy. I started digging. Quietly at first. I asked a few neighbors what method they used to pay rent. Every single one of them said the same thing. Cash. Always cash. No receipts. No contracts. Just a handshake and an envelope slipped under the door. I started keeping notes. Dates, amounts, even sneaky photos of me handing over rent. I pretended to be friendly with him, asking him questions about the repairs and costs he was covering. The more he talked, the more rope he gave himself. By the time I moved out, I had everything I needed. And as I carried the last box out of that miserable little apartment, I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was calm, focused. Because the plan was ready, and it was beautiful. Richard thought he was untouchable. But soon, he'd learn that when you build your empire on lies, it only takes one whisper in the right ear to bring it all crashing down. And I was going to be that whisper. So, tell me, would you have kept paying, or would you have plotted revenge like I did? The day I left that apartment, I didn't feel like a tenant anymore. I felt like a hunter who had finally spotted his prey. Richard thought I was just another broke tenant scurrying away with my tail between my legs, but he had no idea I was already setting the stage for his downfall. The first thing I did was organize everything I had collected. Months of rent notes, dates, photos, and little comments he had made when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I laid it all out on my desk like evidence in a trial. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. But evidence is worthless if no one sees it. I had to make sure it landed in the right hands. That's when I started researching how tax evasion works. I learned about undeclared income, how landlords are required to file rental contracts, report earnings, and pay property taxes. Richard wasn't doing any of that. He was pocketing everything. To the government, it was as if those apartments didn't even exist. And that's when it hit me. All I had to do was shine a spotlight on his little cash-only empire, and the system would do the rest for me. No vandalism, no threats, no dirty tricks. Just cold, hard bureaucracy. I drafted a letter to the tax authorities. Not some vague complaint, but a detailed report. Names, dates, photos, even testimonies from neighbors who agreed to back me up. I made it anonymous, of course. I wasn't about to give him a chance to come after me. But I wrote it with the precision of someone who wanted to see results, not just vent. Still, I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to twist the knife a little deeper. So I started digging into public records. Property ownership, business licenses, anything tied to Richard's name. What I found made me grin like a maniac. He didn't just own our building. He owned 3 others across town. And guess what? Every single one of them operated the same way. Cash, no receipts, no contracts. It wasn't just a mistake or oversight. It was an entire fraudulent system he had built, and he thought he was untouchable because tenants were too scared or too broke to fight back. But I wasn't scared. Not anymore. I added all of it to the report. Addresses, ownership records, even little details like the fact that one of his buildings had multiple illegal sublets in the basement. The more I uncovered, the bigger the case became. By the time I was done, I wasn't just exposing a crooked landlord. I was handing the tax office a goldmine. Now, I could have stopped there. But there was a part of me that wanted to see him sweat. To feel the paranoia before the hammer came down. So I planted seeds. One day, I accidentally bumped into him at a grocery store. He smirked at me, asked if I had found a new place, probably expecting me to look defeated. Instead, I smiled back. Calm. Almost cheerful. And then I dropped just one sentence. By the way, Richard, I hope you're keeping your books clean. You never know who's watching. The color drained from his face for just a moment before he forced a laugh. What are you talking about? He asked, but I just shrugged and walked away. That little crack in his confidence? That was the appetizer. The main course was still coming. Weeks passed. I settled into my new place, but in the back of my mind, I kept wondering if the tax office had acted on my report yet. I didn't have to wonder long. One morning, I got a call from Mrs. Dawson, the sweet old lady from the second floor of my old building. She was practically giddy. You won't believe it, she said, her voice shaking with excitement. Men in suits came to the building this morning. They had clipboards, badges, the whole thing. They went straight to Richard's office. I could practically picture it. Richard, sitting there in his fake leather jacket, confronted by tax investigators demanding records he didn't have. His smug little empire unraveling right in front of him. But this was only the beginning. See, the thing about the tax office is, they don't move quickly, but when they do, they move like a glacier. Unstoppable. Once they sink their teeth into you, they don't let go. Richard was about to learn that the hard way. Over the next few months, whispers spread. He was being audited. He owed back taxes, penalties, interest. People saw him looking more stressed than usual, chain-smoking outside the building, snapping at tenants who dared to ask for repairs. His once cocky swagger was gone. And I watched it all from a distance, savoring every update. Every story from my old neighbors was like another spoonful of dessert. But I wasn't satisfied yet. No, this was nuclear revenge. And nuclear doesn't stop at small explosions. It ends in total devastation. So I made sure the authorities had everything. I updated my report with new information whenever I heard it. I connected dots, pointed out inconsistencies, and basically served them his entire fraudulent career on a silver platter. And then, one day, the news dropped. Richard's properties were being seized. He owed so much in back taxes and fines that he couldn't cover it. The government was preparing to auction off his buildings. It was the perfect storm. His greed, his arrogance, his laziness, it all came crashing down at once. And here's the part that makes me laugh every time. I had just started saving up to maybe buy a small place of my own someday. Nothing fancy, just a little apartment. And when I saw that Richard's building, the one I had lived in, was going up for auction, an insane idea crossed my mind. What if I bought it? Imagine the look on his face, seeing me walk through the doors not as a tenant, but as the new owner. The man he used to squeeze for rent, now holding the keys to his downfall. It was almost too delicious to resist. But that's the story for the next part. So tell me, if you had the chance to buy the very building your greedy landlord lost, just to rub it in his face, would you take it? The moment I heard the word auction, my heart skipped a beat. I had fantasized about Richard losing everything, but the idea that his very building, the place where he had squeezed every tenant dry, was about to go under the hammer? That was poetic justice on another level. Of course, I wasn't rich. I was just a regular person trying to make ends meet. But the thought wouldn't leave me. What if I managed to buy it? What if the building he lorded over, the building where he strutted like a king, ended up with me holding the deed? It became an obsession. I started calculating everything. How much I had in savings, what kind of loans I could apply for, what financial tricks I could pull to even stand a chance at that auction. Most people would have laughed at the idea. Me. I took it dead seriously. I began visiting real estate forums, reading about property auctions, and learning how the process worked. The more I read, the more I realized something crucial. Seized properties often sold for far less than their actual market value, especially when they came with problems like Richard's building. Maintenance issues, bad reputation, unpaid taxes, those scared most buyers away. But me. I didn't see a problem. I saw opportunity. And let's be honest, I didn't just want a place to live. I wanted revenge served with a crown. Owning that building wouldn't just ruin Richard financially. It would humiliate him in a way he could never recover from. But while I was fantasizing, Richard was crumbling. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Tenants told me he'd been seen screaming on the phone outside his office, red-faced and sweating. Another neighbor swore she saw him throwing papers across the room. His little empire was burning, and I was the one who had struck the match. Still, I wasn't reckless. I knew I couldn't just show up at the auction unprepared. So I started quietly networking. I spoke to a friend of a friend who worked in real estate. I learned about how banks sometimes supported young buyers, especially for seized properties. It wasn't easy, and I had to swallow my pride to even ask, but piece by piece, a plan started to form. Meanwhile, Richard was spiraling. His tenants said he'd stopped showing up as often, sending his brother to collect rent instead. But his brother wasn't any better, just a meaner version of him. And when people refused to pay more, knowing Richard's grip was slipping, they were threatened with eviction. Except, here's the irony, Richard no longer had the legal power to evict anyone. The building technically wasn't his anymore. The bank had stepped in, the tax office had their claws in him, and he was fighting a losing battle on all sides. It was beautiful. As the auction date grew closer, I became more and more obsessed. I visited the courthouse website daily, checking for updates. I even went to see the building again, walking past it casually like I was just passing through. Mrs. Dawson spotted me from her window and waved. "You hear the news?" she called down. "They're selling it off next month." I smiled, pretending to be just another curious neighbor. "Yeah, I heard. Wonder who'll end up with it." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Hopefully someone decent. Not another crook like him." That line hit me hard. Because in her eyes, Richard wasn't just a landlord, he was a tyrant. He had stolen years of peace from people like her. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. If I somehow pulled this off, I wouldn't just be humiliating Richard. I'd be rescuing an entire building of tenants from his grip. That thought lit a fire in me. The weeks leading up to the auction were the most nerve-wracking of my life. I scrambled to secure financing, made phone calls, even begged my bank for a line of credit I technically had no business asking for. Every rejection was like a punch to the gut, but I refused to give up. Because this wasn't just about owning property, it was about revenge, justice, and redemption all rolled into one. And then came the day. The courthouse auction hall was packed with people, investors in suits, sharp-eyed opportunists, and a few curious onlookers. The air buzzed with tension. But you know who else was there? Richard. I nearly laughed out loud when I saw him sitting in the back row, looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His hair was messy, his tie crooked, his face pale. He didn't even look like the same smug landlord who once demanded $200 extra from me with a grin. He looked broken. I took a seat near the front, my hands sweating as the auctioneer started rattling off properties. Each one sold to some faceless bidder with more money than I could dream of. And then, finally, our building came up. The auctioneer read out the details. Seized due to unpaid taxes. Market value slashed nearly in half. My pulse pounded in my ears as the bidding began. One investor started with a lowball number. Another countered. The prices climbed. My stomach flipped as I raised my hand for the first time. My voice came out steady. Bid. Every eye turned for a second. I felt Richard's gaze burning into the back of my head. He must have recognized me, because I could almost hear his teeth grinding from across the room. The numbers went higher, faster than I'd hoped. I kept raising my hand, pushing myself to the limit of what I could afford. Each time, my chest tightened. I was playing with fire. If I lost, I'd walk away empty-handed. If I won, I'd be carrying the biggest risk of my life. But then, just when I thought I was about to be outbid, something happened. The investors slowed down. They didn't like the troubled tenant history. They didn't like the bad reputation. They started hesitating. And that's when I realized they didn't see value here. But I did. The gavel slammed down. Sold! And just like that, the building was mine. I turned around slowly, locking eyes with Richard. His face twisted in a mix of rage, disbelief, and utter humiliation. He looked like a man watching his entire life dissolve right in front of him. And the best part? I didn't say a word. I just smiled. But the story didn't end there. Oh no. Because owning the building meant one thing. I was now Richard's replacement. And what I did next would either make me a hero, or someone even darker than him. So tell me, if you had just bought the building your corrupt landlord lost, what would be your first move? When the gavel came down and the building became mine, I felt two emotions at once: exhilaration and fear. Exhilaration because I had just pulled off the most outrageous revenge scheme I'd ever imagined. Fear because now, suddenly, I was responsible for an entire building full of tenants. But the fear faded quickly. Because when I walked out of that courthouse, I caught one last glimpse of Richard. He was standing in the parking lot, staring at me like I had just ripped out his heart and stomped on it. His hands were clenched into fists, his face red, but he didn't say a word. He couldn't. The law had spoken, and the building was no longer his. That moment was worth every sleepless night, every desperate phone call to the bank, every ounce of stress. I didn't just win, I obliterated him. Still, I wasn't about to let victory make me reckless. I needed to play my next moves carefully. Because now I had the power Richard used to abuse. And what I did with it would define everything. My first step was to meet the tenants. I scheduled a meeting in the lobby, and to my surprise, nearly everyone showed up. Mrs. Dawson was there, clutching her little handbag. The young couple who had barely managed to stay through Richard's reign of terror stood near the back, holding hands. Even some new tenants, who had only recently moved in, were curious. I stood in front of them, nervous but determined. "Hi, everyone," I began. "I think you've all heard the news. As of today, I'm the new owner of this building." There were murmurs, skeptical looks. After years of being exploited, no one trusted landlords anymore. I didn't blame them. "But," I continued, raising my voice, "I'm not Richard. I used to live here. I know exactly what you went through, and I want to make things right. You could have heard a pin drop. I'm not raising anyone's rent. Not a single cent," I said firmly. "In fact, the first thing I'm doing is freezing the rent at its current rate for a full year. And unlike Richard, I'm actually going to fix things, repairs, heating, plumbing. All of it. No lies, no excuses." For a moment, no one moved. And then Mrs. Dawson started clapping. Slowly, others joined in. The sound filled the lobby until it was a full round of applause. For the first time in years, they had hope. And for me, that was the sweetest applause I'd ever heard. But while the tenants were celebrating, Richard was unraveling. Word spread fast. People saw him lurking near the building, glaring at me like a ghost haunting his old empire. Once, he even tried to confront me directly. "You think you've won," he spat, cornering me outside the entrance. His voice was hoarse, his eyes bloodshot. "This was mine. I built this. You're nothing without me." I smiled calmly, almost pitying him. "No, Richard. You didn't build this. You bled it dry. And now it's mine. Legally, officially, forever. Maybe next time you'll pay your taxes." He lunged forward, but one of the tenants, a burly mechanic from the third floor, stepped between us. "You heard him," the tenant growled. "Get lost." Richard backed off, his face twisting with impotent rage. He stormed away, but I knew he wasn't gone for good. Men like him don't just vanish. They rot, slowly, bitterly, clinging to the past. Meanwhile, I kept my promises. The first thing I did was hire a real plumber to fix the pipes that had groaned and leaked for years. Then I had the heating system serviced so no one would freeze through the winter. A fresh coat of paint in the stairwell. Even small things, like new light bulbs in the hallway. None of it was expensive, but the difference it made to the tenants was huge. And you know what? They started treating me like more than just a landlord. They treated me like a savior. The young couple brought me cookies one evening to thank me. Mrs. Dawson knit me a scarf. The mechanic offered to fix my car for free any time I needed. Every act of kindness was another nail in Richard's coffin. Because while he had built nothing but resentment, I was building loyalty, gratitude, and respect. But I wasn't done yet. Because there was one final piece of revenge I hadn't revealed. See, the auction had left Richard broke. His properties were gone, his business destroyed, his reputation shredded. But I wanted him to feel something deeper. Humiliation. So I planned a little surprise. I waited until the renovations were done, until the building looked better than it had in decades. And then, I threw a small party for the tenants. A celebration of new beginnings. Balloons in the lobby, snacks, even a cake with "Welcome Home" written on it. And who just happened to wander by that evening? Richard. I swear it was fate. He saw the decorations, heard the laughter, and walked right up to the doors. For a moment, he stood there, staring in through the glass. And then his eyes met mine. I raised my glass in a mock toast. "To Richard," I said loudly, making sure everyone heard. "The man who taught us how not to run a building." The tenants laughed, clapping, cheering. Richard's face turned purple with fury. He slammed his fist against the glass and stormed off into the night. That was the last time I ever saw him near the building. From that day forward, the tenants and I thrived. The building became a community instead of a prison. And Richard, he faded into nothing, a bitter man with nothing left to his name. But even as I enjoyed my victory, I knew one thing: revenge isn't just about winning. It's about making the other person realize exactly why they lost. And Richard knew. Oh, he knew. Because every time he walked past that building, if he ever dared, he'd see lights shining in the windows, laughter echoing in the halls, and the knowledge that I had taken everything from him and built something better. So tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you have stopped at destroying him financially, or would you have gone further and taken his empire for yourself? Owning Richard's building should have been the end of the story. After all, I had everything I wanted: security, respect, and the sweetest revenge imaginable. But life has a funny way of twisting the knife even further when someone truly deserves it. Because for Richard, losing the building wasn't rock bottom. It was just the beginning of the fall. News spread quickly in town. Everyone knew about the auction, the unpaid taxes, the investigation. Other landlords whispered his name like a cautionary tale, and tenants from his old properties told stories of his scams and cruelty. His reputation was shredded beyond repair. Even the kind of shady characters he used to brag to wanted nothing to do with him. I heard rumors that he tried to start over. First, he attempted to rent out a single apartment under the table again. But the tax office was watching him closely now. One complaint, and officials came knocking on his door. That scheme collapsed before it even began. Then, he tried to work as a property consultant. But who would take advice from a man whose entire portfolio had been seized? His name was poison in the industry. Everywhere he turned, doors slammed shut. And each time, I couldn't help but smile. Because this wasn't me doing anything. It was his own greed finally catching up to him. Meanwhile, my life was the complete opposite. The building thrived. Tenants who once lived in fear now lived in peace. The atmosphere was so different that even visitors commented on it. What had once been a crumbling, miserable place now felt alive again. One evening, I was sitting in my new office on the ground floor. Yes, I had turned Richard's old office into mine, when Mrs. Dawson knocked. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly. "For everything. For giving us our home back." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Because up until then, I thought this was just about revenge. But hearing her say that made me realize something. I hadn't just destroyed Richard. I had built something better in his place. And that, perhaps, was the greatest revenge of all. Still, I couldn't resist one last twist of the knife. Months later, I heard Richard was completely broke. He had sold his car, was living in a dingy little apartment on the edge of town, and was drowning in debt from the fines and penalties. He had no empire, no loyal tenants, no power. Just a bitter man clinging to the memory of what he used to have. So I decided to pay him a visit. Not to gloat, at least, not directly, but to show him just how far he'd fallen. When I knocked on his door, he opened it halfway, and for a moment, he didn't even recognize me. His hair was greasy, his shirt stained, his eyes hollow. He looked decades older than the last time I'd seen him. "What do you want?" he rasped. I smiled politely. "I just came to say thank you, Richard." He frowned. "For what?" "For teaching me how not to live. Because of you, I learned what greed does to a man. Because of you, I took everything you had and made it better. And because of you, I'll never be the kind of landlord, or person, you were." His face twisted with rage, but he didn't have the strength to argue. He just slammed the door in my face. And as I walked away, I realized something important. Revenge hadn't just destroyed Richard. It had set me free. For years, I had felt powerless under his thumb. Every time he raised the rent, every time he lied about repairs, every time he smirked at my helplessness, it had chipped away at me. But now, I wasn't powerless anymore. I was the one in control. And the best part? I hadn't broken the law. I hadn't stooped to his level. I had simply exposed him, let the system do its work, and claimed what was rightfully mine. To this day, whenever I walk through the halls of that building, I smile. The walls are painted fresh, the heat works, The tenants greet me warmly. It's more than just a property. It's a symbol. A reminder that justice, when served right, is more satisfying than anything money can buy. And Richard, well, if he ever walks by, he'll see his old kingdom thriving without him. He'll hear laughter where there used to be complaints. He'll smell fresh paint instead of mold. And he'll know, deep in his soul, that I took everything he built on lies and turned it into something better than he ever could. That's nuclear revenge. Not just destroying your enemy, but making sure they live long enough to watch you succeed without them. So now, I leave you with this question. Was I right to take it this far? Or did I cross a line when I decided to not only ruin him, but replace him?